On this episode of Survival Dispatch News, we're going to talk about bug out planning with a former SF operative. This Survival Dispatch video is brought to you by Nutrient Survival. Nourish your body, power your mind. And we're back with Survival Dispatch News, and I have an absolutely top-notch commentator today on the panel. We have Mike Glover from Fieldcraft Survival. Mike, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No, it's great. Mike is a former SF operator, like I talked about in the beginning. I'm sure that he can touch on a lot of things that maybe you haven't thought about when we're discussing bug out planning. Now, this is something that Mike and I have talked about a lot, right? You got to have a plan, regardless of whether you're planning to bug in, bug out, or just for your get home bag, you need to have a plan. But one thing we haven't really touched on is, what does that plan look like? So we thought we'd bring in somebody who might have a little bit of expertise in that. Mike, kind of tell us a little bit about what you're doing at Fieldcraft Survival, and what's your approach when looking at a bug out plan? How should people formulate that, and what should they take into consideration?
Yeah, so Fieldcraft does education, training, and provides products in the field of preparedness. We say that we train civilians to be prepared for the worst case scenario. And if they plan for the worst case, they're kind of covering down on everything in between. If you're planning for the worst case, like bugging out in a natural disaster, well, you're covering everything in between, and you might be prepared for the accident, the first aid event, the list goes on. So that's what we do. In the context of bugging out, we talk about bugging out or bugging in as simply displacing from one bad place or bad circumstance to a better one. It doesn't always have to be the safe house or, the rural off-grid cabin. It could just be you're in a bad situation where there's a natural disaster ripping through the area, and you have to have a plan to displace from that situation into a better situation. And I think that approach is more realistic for people who can't afford, 5-acre off-grid cabins in the middle of Arizona.
No, absolutely. I mean, obviously, that's the dream, right? We all want to have that bug out location, but sometimes we just don't have the capability to do that. That's one thing that, we deal with a lot in the preparedness community is, well, we all have finances, right? We have a life. We have to, take care of business on our end first before we can get those nicer locations. So, Mike Sterling, of course, my stalwart co-host here on Survival Dispatch News. Give us your thoughts on this. Obviously, you're the man with the plan. So what are you looking for in a bug out plan?
So I just kind of go back to my norms. You kind of go with what you know, and where we operated all the time was probability matrices constantly. I just constantly had to harp on that, constantly got beat on that. So it's ingrained into my head. So you go with probability matrix and you look at what is the absolute most probable event for you to have to prep for. Well, that's what you're going to prep for. And then the next item and the next item and the next item until the things that are on there, like you get to EMPs, that is incredibly unlikely. And if you look at the items that are higher on your probability matrix, you are finding items that everything is already overlapped anyway. So one set of preps usually will wind up covering like your top 5 items for your area. Natural disasters are your most likely. And like we discussed on SDN last night, your next likely is going to wind up being financial collapse, or at least major financial dip and erosion. So, that's where I'm at. I look at probabilities and I prep for those probabilities.
That's a really good point to, kind of touch on. Is there's a lot of, dramatization here in the prepper community, like, the SHTF, the end of the world as we know it, Mad Max. That's the term I get here thrown around a lot lately, is the big term. And that is obviously a lower probability situation, but definitely something that we could prepare for. And it doesn't hurt to be prepared for, but not necessarily your big focus. So, Mike, give us your thoughts. What are the types of disasters people should really be preparing for, and when would a bug out situation be appropriate for that?
Yeah, I think, for me, I would say you could lump together a lot of the different disasters, and they would solicit the same responses. So, for example, in Lahaina, Yeah, sure. People have talked about wildfires because they've had wildfires there before, but the tsunami threat was more on the forefront of their minds because they had the system and the infrastructure in place to facilitate that, including the sirens. So when you look at those two disasters, what's the difference in bugging out? Well, not much. I mean, one, the time constraint. If it's a wildfire, you might have a little bit of time. Like in Lahaina, they didn't have much time at all, given the wind. But the same for tsunami. So I would say plan for the displacement and then weigh the differences or the slight modifications that are going to be for the disaster that's specific, whether it's natural or man-made. And I would think, if you're looking at that, that means you have to look at principle-based plans. You have to follow the principles. And if you follow the principles, then that's going to set you up for success. And we can go into that as well.
Yeah, it's just like, doing shooting or anything like that. If you just apply the fundamentals across the board, you're 90% of the way there. And with just small changes based upon the current situation. So it's fundamentals. Apply the fundamentals over and over again, and you're probably not going to go wrong.
So yeah, definitely the principles are incredibly important. And so, Mike, you kind of touched on those principles. Let's talk about that. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would break down is some of the logistic components, like equipment common to all. What type of equipment do you have in your home, on your person, and then in your vehicle? Then I would look at the transportation of yourself and displacing from that situation a bad circumstance into a better one. For example, in Lahaina, we know they had the profound wildfire that ripped through there with 60 plus mile an hour winds. So if you were planning to have a vehicle and that vehicle was a truck or a car, likely, like many people, you'd have been gridlocked based on the situation where power lines were collapsing, they were locking down the roads, and police were all over the place trying to keep the public safe by shutting down roads. I saw a 2-hour video where a guy GoPro'd the entire situation of him displacing and got basically boxed in until he decided to park into a parking lot and displace from his vehicle, which is a good option. So when we look at mobility, for example, you got to have contingencies. You got to have your primary, your alternate, contingency, and emergency, your PACE plan. And so if you have the car as your primary, you might have a motorcycle or a side-by-side as your alternate, and the list goes on, maybe down to your emergency, which might be a bicycle. The whole family jumps on, pedaled bicycles to displace because it's whatever you have to do in an extremist situation. So, when we look at equipment common to all, when we look at your mobility rig, the equipment that's on your person, a lot of people don't create habits where they're every day carrying those items, which I like because that's a lifestyle shift. If you carry, for example, a first aid kit on your person at all times, where you don't have to depend on the 72-hour bug out bag that's located in the closet off the front door of your house, because you might not be able to access that. So we start with the individual, we break it down to your mobility rig or your vehicle, and then further accelerate that or enhance that kit by what's in your home. So that's just a good principle to follow, and having the right equipment and the right transportation means to displace.
Yeah. To that note, one of the things that I'm always talking about here is the soft gear tier methodology, where you basically have the exact same stuff starting on yourself, moving up to your jacket, moving up to your pack, moving up to this, and you're living out of the highest level of gear that you have available. But you've always got, if I want to having to dump my pack, if I lose my pack, anything like that, I still have gear on me. I still have options. And that's all that gear does, is it gives you options. And it just does, it doesn't do everything for you. You have to have the skills commensurate with the gear. And that's one of the biggest sells for this industry, is trying to get it into people's head that training trumps gear all day, every day. You've got to have that. Now, the tools, mankind being a tool using animal, you need both, but you should not be relying on the tools nearly as much as you should be relying upon the skills.
Yeah, we break that down into basically capability and capacity. If if you have if you only have the capacity on your person with 2 pockets and maybe your fanny pack to carry a little bit of gear, well, as you expand that into a vehicle or your home, or 72-hour, modeling backpack, whatever it is, you're enhancing your capacity, which would, in theory, level up your capability. So if I have a tourniquet on person, I want my mobility rig or my vehicle to have, basically be an ambulance. But if I don't have the training to allow me to enhance my capability because I'm not trained on the equipment that's in that, then it does nothing for you. And I'm afraid that's kind of the issue with the industry as a whole, because when you're selling a product without the education, what you're doing is you're building complacency into people with a false sense of security, because they get the backpack and it has all the cool gear, but they never utilize it. And if you train the equipment based on your environment, you'll realize a lot of the stuff that's the crap in the bag you don't need. And so you start streamlining kit, because it's, what do you need for that specific environment? If you're displacing out of a bad situation, for example, in Hawaii or Lahaina or Maui, and you have a water procurement kit. Well, is that as important as, off-grid or offline maps? It's not. So if you're weighing the two, well, I have a water procurement kit and the ability to filtrate water. Well, how long is it going to take me to displace? Well, it's not going to take me that long to displace to somewhere where there's potentially fresh water, versus if I'm offline and I don't have a cellular phone because, the infrastructure collapses immediately like it did in Lahaina, and then I don't have the cell phone tower infrastructure, so I have no use of map imagery on my phone, then having a Garmin might be the best bet over that piece of equipment. And you weigh those ounces and pounds when you're looking at, hey, what am I trying to set myself up for success in? And I think all of those things, there's a foundation as a baseline of equipment for survival and first aid, and then there's everything else. Like if I jumped into an environment, if I was free falling into an environment with my team, let's say we're doing a training exercise in Utah or Dugway Proving Grounds. If I did that, there's a baseline, and then there's all the things that support myself in that environment. Well, I think that's how it works in preparedness across the country, because there's so many variations of environment depending on where you live.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody looks at my kit and they usually say, "Oh, wow, Mike, you really roll heavy." Well, for one, I travel a lot all over the country. So my primary goal is not bugging out. My primary goal is getting home. And like I'm getting ready to do a 1,500-mile trip out to Wyoming to go do some work out there. And the whole thing is going to be based around the trip out and trip back is going to be based exclusively on what's the best way for me to be able to get home in a bad situation. Fuel plans and everything like that. But you're absolutely right. When it comes to gear versus skills, it is unfortunately, it's a human condition. Psychologically, human beings are predisposed to feeling comfort from having the tools. Now, they unfortunately stop there and don't move on to the next step of getting the skills that go with it. And that was the one big thing that we always pushed over at Crisis Application Group when I was working with them over there was, people would say, okay, what kind of holster do I need for this? Don't show up with a holster. We've got a whole bunch of just, Uncle Mike's garbage stuff here. I'm going to put a holster on you, use that holster, and then you will now learn what kind of holster you need. Get some education first, then go spend money.
Yeah, very important. I think all very important points. And, that's I think what we typically miss in all of this, a lot of people ask me because they want the end all be all solution. It's less likely an end all be all solution and more a comprehensive course of action to plan to navigate the plan, and then wargaming it. It's a conversation. It's like, hey, what's the objective? Let's talk through this, versus you just ask me, hey, what's the best gear? The most common question I get is like, hey, Mike, what's the best EDC, or what's your EDC? And I'm like, that's an irrelevant question. The first question is, what do you wear every day? What condition are you planning for? Are we in the middle of winter in Montana? Are we in the middle of summer in board shorts in Florida? All of these things a matter in a conversation, which is how you develop a plan for bugging out or bugging in. It starts with course of action development, or what we used to call wargaming. I mean, you know this, like the I think what separates Green Berets from most special operations guys in service is this idea of detailed planning or contingency based planning. You know, I did missions as a Green Beret guy where we just went to an ISO facility, an isolation facility, and planned for a week. And guys were like, "Well, that's not cool." I'm like, "That's the start point to the cool stuff.
That's how it's done.
That's how it's done, and that's how we're detail oriented, and have all the contingencies and the service support and all the things that make operating and flexing and adapting possible. Just going out and shooting guns and doing the cool guy stuff, that's one sliver of the pie.
That's LARPing.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So the first thing that was said to me when I started Tools and Methods Division in EOD school up at Indian Head, Maryland, crappy place. Don't ever go there. The first thing was they had all these tools laid out, and I mean, we're talking, it looked like a Snap-on truck on those tables that day. And somebody picked up one of the tools and they said, "This is a tool in your toolbox." And I remember it being a crescent wrench. And the guy said, the tech said, "Just because I can hammer a nail in with this crescent wrench does not make it the right tool for the job."
Yeah, that's so funny. I had a similar circumstance I was in Iraq as a CIA contractor, and I was the heavy breaching lead. And I was teaching 100 contractors about heavy breaching. And I had been to heavy breaching through the CIA, so I've been to some good courses. And the entire premise of the course was, hey, if there's a situation where you get on the X and you have to, you know, a armored car is flipped on its side, how are you going to breach that vehicle and get to the people that need help and extract them? And so I went through all this different equipment that the agency had and showed all the TTPs and taught all this stuff, all to get to a point where in the last 5 minutes, I said, yeah, all this equipment's nice, thousands of dollars worth of equipment, very high speed. But then I took a hammer and a flathead screwdriver, and
or a Halligan bar.
Yeah, I jammed it through the locking mechanism, because this is true on most armored vehicles, and which is the weak point. Latched it through there and turned it, and literally opened the door, and then extracted the guys that were inside. And everybody was like, "Wow, why did you start with that?" I'm like, "Well, it's about tools. You got to have options, but always plan for contingencies. And I'm not going to teach you the primary. I'm going to teach you the emergency, contingency, and alternate, and reverse order, so you have more options."
It's always backwards planning.
Yeah.
I've gotten there. How do I get there?
Yep.
Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. 100%. Yeah. So, all right. So, you know, the one big thing that I talk whenever I'm talking about this is that bugging out is predominantly based on a couple of different factors. One, security. Okay. We always understand that security is going to be an issue. Two is going to be an environmental condition, right? Say in this situation, you know, we wind up in a situation where it has stopped raining and I can't grow crops and I can't keep my critters alive, right? That's a problem. That's grounds for having to bug out, but it's not a hey, we've got to go immediately. All right, we got to plan this whole thing out. And then there's the in extremis situations like you were talking about, and that's pretty much one of the few reasons that I'm going to wind up getting booted out of my place, is if you're in a situation where I've got like a hazmat spill upwind of me or anything like that, and I've mapped out where the predominant areas are for that sort of thing, just because, you know, I still got all that WMD software for doing that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, you're looking at that, and yeah, those are the primary areas that I see. What do you think?
Yeah, I think those are good principles and good primary ways to look at it. I also think, you know, as a civilian, you know, I use military acronyms and things that I learned as a 18-year-old private in Ranger School. I mean, you know, Sergeant Major eats sugar cookies, the acronym for planning, for basic planning and operations orders. You know,
Well,
you identify.
well, that's because you were a Bravo. We'll
Yeah.
get you some crayons after this.
Yeah, I was a Bravo as a 11 series and 18 series, so I was the Nug all the way through. When I look at basic planning, it's very simple to start with a plan that's a 5W, or identifying the situation, understanding what the end objective is and the mission, figuring out how you're going to accomplish that through the execution, looking at command and signal and all the things that you're going to be able to identify in order to make that plan happen. And certainly all the support mechanisms and service and support that's going to make it happen as well. And I think when people apply a bugging out, the most significant thing to do is do friendly coordination and the service support component. Because a lot of people say, when you say, hey, what's your bug out plan? You live in an apartment complex in San Francisco. If there's an earthquake and you need to displace, how are you going to do it? And typically it's like, yeah, well, I'm going to go to my buddy's place in Tahoe, South Lake Tahoe. And it's like, have you talked to your buddy about that? Have you identified the routes? Everything's going to be gridlocked. Have you chosen the platform? You know, have you set aside the fuel, the bag? Have an understanding of how this entire thing's going to work security wise? Do you have backup communications? So I think the first start point is identifying, hey, what's the end objective here? If something bad happens and I want to displace to my buddy's house in South Lake Tahoe, then you can, again, like you said, backwards plan and start identifying all the weaknesses or all the things that you don't have lined in place. And so a lot of people think bug out and they think EMP, they think zombie apocalypse, they think this preparedness stigma. But a lot of this is, hey, what happens if my house is destroyed by a tornado? What happens if I get notification that a Cat 5 hurricane is going to hit the coast where my house is? You certainly can hastily start planning some of these things. I mean, that's typically how it works anyways. With a plan in Murphy's Law, it's going to fall apart really quickly. But what we always recommend is start with a deliberate plan, have the conversation with the people you love, with your community, with the people that you're going to displace into, and then start sourcing and identifying the weaknesses, and then start sharing that, disseminating that. If you have a 72-hour bug out bag and you start the process with your family, it is, one, going to bring your family closer together. Two, it's going to teach your family a lot about what to do in an extremist situation. They're going to get the free rehearsals. And three, it creates the culture and mindset that the things that you're doing are intentional. You know, a lot of people want to check the block. They buy the bag of crap off Amazon. They put it by the front door, have no idea what's in the bag. But they don't do a full spectrum approach to it. Just be intentional about it. Take a day of a weekend and say, family, we're going to get together. Let's talk about this. Let's identify some of our weaknesses and let's fill those gaps with equipment, with education, and then make ourselves better.
So the training acumen that I've always held, especially from my training in the background, was not train the what, but train the why. And if you have the why, it allows you to be able to adjust on the fly. And that's honestly, that's probably the biggest thing that we always taught in EOD school was, I'm not teaching you how to specifically lockstep do a job. I'm teaching you the reasoning and the mechanics why this happens, and I'm teaching you how to think your way through it, because absolutely none of these situations no two situations is going to be alike, period. So we're going to teach you the why, not the how. And yeah, absolutely, we're right on the money for all this. And when we talk about, and a lot of people don't understand the concept of service support. And I'll just throw out, service support is the non-door kicker term in the military. Everybody who's not combat arms is considered service support. So you've got your logistics people, you've got your fuelers, you've got your medical people, you've got all that. And yeah, what is it? 8 service support people for every grunt, something like that, somewhere around there.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, but I mean, you got, the U.S. military is ridiculous about. I mean, we're one of the only militaries out there that pretty much keeps our people fed pretty much all the time. And that's a big thing. And mail moves and things like that. I mean, we've got a massive tail. It takes a while to get moving, but boy, when it does get moving.
Yeah, that's really important to note, because in a situation where you have to bug out, you are your own first response and your service support. Like you're doing it all. And, we've identified that, like you said, adaptability is the number one characteristic in surviving any difficult situation. And that has to do with critical thinking. And one of the problems inherently in survival and preparedness, especially the tactical realm, for example, is nobody's teaching how to critically think. I mean, people fall in love with themselves on a flat range, putting holes in paper. It's like, that's very easy to accomplish. That's the choreographed emulation, right? But that has nothing to do with critical thinking. When a Instagram influencer runs through a gauntlet shooting paper and steel like it's a zombie apocalypse, that has nothing to do with reality, because you have to discriminate targets. You have to identify friend from foe. You have to make rapid decisions under stress. And so I tell people all the time, like, doing planning and doing course of action development through a conversation is more important than standing on a flat range, falling in love with yourself for the gram. I think it's so missed in training. We do personal defense at Fieldcraft Survival, where it's all simunitions based scenarios. And I get gunfighters, in air quotes, that come in, have all the Gucci gear, and they're the first to make the mistake. They default to a script they develop on a range, a bad habit, and they shoot the guy. And I'm like, why did you do that? It's like, well, he was getting in my way. I'm like, you realize you go to prison for the rest of your life for that? Like, it's like, well, he lunged at my spouse. I'm like, a person who lunges at your spouse is not going to get killed in self-defense, and you're going to get away with it. You go to prison forever if you do that. And they're like, oh my God, like, maybe I should paper and steel. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't just shoot paper and steel, and that be my protocol for training. All those things are very important, and I think critical thinking is absent in all of these things. And if you want to start building critical thinking skills, if you want to start improving that, simply have the conversations and start wargaming some of these things. That's the first step in planning, by the way, is course of action development and wargaming.
Yeah. And we really started pushing. We really seriously started pushing the entire concept of stress inoculation, and I know you know what that's about. And really notching up the stressors in a lot of our courses when we teach. And man, I'll tell you what, you see a lot of people, like you said, man, the grammars, they're out there, they're on the range, they're coming up for pistol 2, rifle 2, something like that, and you start throwing the serious frigging stress at them. You start jacking it up. Man, they can't handle it. They start going out of the way. But you start getting those people that can handle stress, and they're capable of making decisions rationally in a very stressful situation. And that's that speaks to exactly what you were talking about. Of these guys, they've got that, for lack of a better term, they've got that battle drill built into their head that I'm going to just do this. You can't always do that, man. You're in a stressful situation. You need to be thinking through the stressful situation. Sometimes retreating a little bit is not necessarily a bad idea, especially if it's one of those things that you could potentially go to prison for, the rest of your days for. And I mean, guys like us, man, they're going to throw us in a hole and throw away the hole.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. And we talk about bugging out when you had mentioned it before about bugging in. Like there's a lot of justification, especially with the right protocols, the right preemptive protocols, to bug in and hold down the fort. I mean, you're most likely to be vulnerable and exploitable when you displace. And like we've seen in every natural disaster, there are a percentage of the population that are going to exploit the circumstance. They're evil people who are going to take advantage of good people, whether that's looting their burned down homes, or actually taking advantage of people like in Katrina, where people were getting murdered, raped. I have one of my jiu-jitsu professor, Greg Lappin, was a patrol officer in New Orleans during Katrina, and he saw it all. The stories he have is sickening. And it's like, yeah, that's going to happen really fast. It's not going to take a long time for people to get desperate, and you got to be prepared. So you might not want to displace. You might want to hold the fort, especially if you have all the things in place to defend the fort.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's I constantly scream that at people, and I'm like, listen, if you have the logistics and you have the security wherewithal to be able to hold where you are, then hold where you are. Now, if you're in a situation like a lot of those people were in Sarajevo, where the city's in the process of getting surrounded by the bad guys, and they're getting ready to start dumping buckets of artillery ammo down onto you. Okay, that's a good reason to leave. Yeah, you can't fight back against 152 rounds falling from the sky. But if you're in a situation, like you said, Katrina, say you're in a 2-story house and you're able to actually hang in there and you have the logistical wherewithal to be able to stay there, it may actually be worthwhile for you to stay. Yeah, that place was, I remember that very clearly, all the train wreck that was that entire thing. And I was just actually down there early this year in NO, and it honestly, it hasn't recovered from the way that it used to be. I used to go there all the time when I was stationed in Texas, and it has not recovered at all. It's a mess.
It's crazy, man. It's crazy.
Yeah, like the Haitian gangs. The
Yeah.
Haitian gangs are all over the place, man, and they don't care. Those guys are off the freaking chain.
Yeah, the lobber.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, so getting home, let's hear your thoughts on long range get home. Like I said, I'm getting ready to do that. I'm open to all outside opinions on that sort of thing.
Yeah, like you said, with your own situation and planning, you talked about fuel. That's the number one consideration in mobility that people don't pay attention to. They buy the $100,000 Raptor, have all the cool and sexy, and they don't have any fuel reserves. They don't have any extended fuel tanks. They haven't even thought about it. So, when I was in Libya, for example, what we were dealing with, I spent a year in Libya. What I was dealing with, both on the CIA side and the special operations side, was the lack of fuel across the country because of all the volatility that was going on. If you're, for example, a militia, a terrorist, a bad actor, or even a good actor, the first thing you would want to do is seize control of the resources. And the most profound resource need is fossil fuels, because that's how the world is going to continue to move forward. That's generator fuel. That's fuel for the logistics train. Exactly.
Keeps that wheel running.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't think about that, because conveniently the semi tractor that's, driving across the country or driving out of your local refinery is delivering fuel to your pump. You go to the pump and everything's fine. I mean, and a simple storm can knock out power to the pump. And now most pumps aren't manually processed because you have to pay with a card. And even if you pay with cash and it's electric, I've been in a situation even in Utah, you don't have any fuel coming to the pump. So just small things can disable that capability. So the first thing I would look at is extending your range. That's like a long range fuel tank. Long Range America has them. Titan fuel tanks has them. And then put one in the truck bed. You can get them from 50 to 75 gallons. You can get 30 to 50 or 75 gallons underneath the rig. And that will greatly enhance your ability to kind of displace. The next thing I would look at, especially when you're looking at a mobility vehicle, like you have your vehicle in hand, is having redundancy built into your vehicle. And, I get it. Like a lot of people can afford certain aspects of what I'm talking about, but you don't have to be advanced in this. You don't have to have a Ducati on the back of your truck. I mean, like, think about an XR650. I mean, it's a $6,000 motorcycle. You could put a XR650 on the back of your vehicle, and if you're trying to make it home and you look at the legs that you're able to make, potentially, if you have a truck and it's good for a certain amount of range, and then you bug out on your motorcycle, and that's a certain amount of range, man, that's a great thing to have in contingencies. So we started carrying for our rigs motorcycles to do recreation. And what we say is like, you don't have to plan for the worst case scenario and then be the prepper and lock and step and never utilize the equipment. Plan for recreation. And when you plan for recreation, like I don't plan to get off the grid because, I want to meet people out in the middle of nowhere. I'm displacing from infrastructure. So by benefit, when I set up my truck and my camper and all the things, I'm literally setting myself up to bug out or, get back home to bug in. So on top of that, I would look at bicycles or electric bikes as a potential option.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen them. We've reviewed quite a number of e-bikes recently, and man, there is some great stuff out there. The technology has come a light years from where it was when I saw it last. And man, it is a viable option now. We're actually looking at getting a couple of them to hook onto the back of the camper and just keep those as an option, that part of the pace plan.
Yeah, 5 years ago for Discovery Channel, I tested a couple electric bikes. We pushed them out of aircraft. We did a whole bunch of tests on them, and the technology just wasn't there. Yep. Now, the pedal bike with the integrated electronics and the electric component, it's dialed in, and it's actually a lot cheaper. I mean, the bike that I tested years ago was a $10,000 bike. That same bike today is $2,000. So it's more viable. And, a lot of preparedness people have a narrow scope of focus because of their bias. A lot of guys, like when I review electric anything, they just freak out because they're like, oh, climate control and politics. I'm like, guys,
my EMP, shut up.
It's like if your only contingency for a bug out is your EMP proof, small crate 350, name the platform, that is not good enough. You have to be able to flex and adapt. And if testing this equipment and looking at the whole spectrum of it is going to make, your biased opinion a little uncomfortable, then so be it. You need to be able to flex and adapt into these certain things. And I think hybrid vehicles, for example, are a potential good option. The new Jeep that has a 25-mile lifespan on the electric components, that's not a lot. But in a worst case scenario where you potentially go on gas for a period of time and you have no other option, having 25 miles addition to that that's electric, man, that's going to save your ass potentially.
And 25 miles on foot still sucks. I don't care who you are.
Yeah, and
25 miles sucks.
Yeah, if you're a smart prepper and then you got a ruck, imagine doing a 25-mile ruck. I've done lots of those, and you don't want to do that. I would rather have the electric hybrid version of it and have options.
Yeah, I am not in that shape anymore, man. I am not that guy anymore. That was a long time ago, kids. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's like you said, it's all options. If you've got the options in front of you, that all feeds into your pace plan, which feeds into your contingency plans, which, eventually gets you from point A to point Z, period. And, like the big plan that I've got on mine, we were talking about, have you contacted the people that you intend to bug out to? I have a long string of, for lack of a better term, safe haven points that I can take on my 1,500-mile trip home. And if anything goes wrong, I just bounce from safe haven to safe haven to safe haven. And there you go. I mean, you can at least get a little bit of rest at a safe haven, maybe fill up your water at the bare minimum. And, heck, that's something, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's like you said, it's all planning in advance and sitting down, crunching those numbers in your head, and then talking to other people, because trying to do any of this stuff in an echo chamber is the absolute worst idea that anybody can ever have.
Yeah, you got to be willing to be kind of open-minded to this stuff. And there's no end-all be-all solutions to any of this stuff. I mean, I've heard people preach on pedestals and platforms about how their solution is the solution. And it's like, human behavior is so fluid. Natural disasters, there are so many variables. So all of these things require adaptability and open mind and being able to flex along the way. And most people in the preparedness space seemingly have a mindset where again there's an end all be all solution. I mean, if you would have told ham radio guys, 3 years ago that GMRS was going to be a thing, they would have said there's no way, and it's a thing. I do more GMRS in my mobility rigs than I do ham radio, and it's like all of these things, like you said, if you have more options, then you have more opportunities. And I hope people keep an open mind to all of this and be willing to listen to the conversation, because that's only going to make you better prepared.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, hey, I'll tell you what, I really appreciate you coming on here with us. It's always good to talk to somebody else that has a head on their shoulders, that actually understands the reality for what it is, and the pain in the butt that the whole thing can be, and trying to deal with the human condition and human psychology when it comes to all of this sort of thing. But if you've got any little, let's chuck a couple of kernels of wisdom at us before we finish up today.
Yeah, I would just say, preparedness. When I started Fieldcraft, I wanted it to be an open forum for everybody from all walks of life. I think every American, my book Prepared is in different countries, in South Korea, Ukraine, the list goes on. I think it's something that should be available for everybody. And it's cool to live a lifestyle of preparedness, because as we know, disaster is an equal opportunist. It doesn't care your wealth bracket, your background, your ethnicity. It's going to hand you your ass the same. And I think it's very important to understand that, just because we're talking about worst case scenarios, my worst case scenario potentially isn't somebody else's worst case scenario. A house fire could be your worst case scenario. An accident could be your worst case scenario, especially if you don't have training, if you don't have the education, and you don't have the equipment. So I encourage people to go out there, get educated, get all the information that you can, and be equipped and be prepared. It's very important what you guys are doing. I think these conversations, and always innovating the thought processes, expanding people's ideas, evolving their minds is very important, because you have to be adaptable. If you're rigid, if you're conventional, you'll just fall by the wayside and potentially be a victim of all this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you very much again for coming here and chatting with us today. I really appreciate it. And for those of you at home, if you enjoy this kind of content, make sure that you like, subscribe, click that little bell button so you can get notifications. We always appreciate that. And if you want to become a Survival Dispatch insider and get all of this kind of information without any kind of big tech censorship screwing down on us, then go on ahead and click on the links below, and we will sort you out. Until then, everybody have a safe day.